Welcome to the Braver Angels Roundtable podcast. I'm your co-host, Mónica Guzmán. This is the podcast where we dare to talk politics across the red-blue divide and have fun doing it. So I am pumped to tackle our big topic today, the media. Dun, dun, dun. But before we get to that, I am joined once again by a fantastic panel of Braver Angels leaders who I will invite to say hi to you, our listeners, with today's check-in question. So the 2020 Olympics, they might be 1 year late and many thousands of spectators short, but they are wrapping up yet another run this Sunday. So in 10 seconds or less, April Lawson, if you could be good enough to win gold in one Olympic sporting event, which would it be and why?
This is an easy question for me. The answer is archery. I have loved archery since I was little. I'm having a Lord of the Rings themed wedding in a month. I'm just that kind of nerd. So archery.
Archery it is. Ciaran.
I would win gold in soccer so that I could bring glory to America on the world stage in the world sport.
The world sport. Love it. John Wood Jr.
Beautiful. So I would take home the gold in boxing, and that's because I actually grew up boxing. I actually had 2 amateur fights when I was 8 years old. People don't know this. One was an exhibition.
When you were 8?
When I was 8 years old, right. One was an exhibition, so it didn't count officially. The other was an official match. I was ahead on points. The judges robbed me, I'll have you know. So my amateur boxing record stands to this day as 0-1, which unfortunately is the exact same as my political record. One of these days I'd like to win something, but yeah. So yeah.
The takeaway, don't make John Wood Jr. mad in person because he's got a 1-2 punch coming back at you. And to close us out, I, Mónica Guzmán, have a soft spot for race walking as an Olympic event. Some of you may have never heard of it. It's pretty ridiculous. YouTube it if you haven't seen it. It looks wild, but it is the one event that my home country, Mexico, has dominated over the last 50 years. So viva Mexico. So with that, now that we have flexed our totally imaginary muscles, it's time to move on to our big topic for this episode. And for that, I'm going to pass the torch to my co-host, April. April, take us away.
Well, thank you, Moni. I'm trying to erase my smirk around race walking. I feel like I just need to go outside and look at the 6 a.m. and find the older people in their tracksuits and anyway. I have full confidence in you, and I respect your desire to win the gold in that. Okay, so media and democracy. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." But for all the promise of free press, sometimes it feels like our news media make it harder, not just to have a functional democratic government, but to have functional democratic conversations, the kind that give the public things like reliable information, clear shared narratives, and the ability to deliberate productively through tough issues. All around us, we are seeing flare-ups around media ethics, bias, diversity, misinformation and disinformation, partisanship, trust, with 60% of Americans saying in a 2020 Gallup poll that they have little or no trust in the media at all. Here at Braver Angels, we have a way to invite both left and right to explore the strengths and weaknesses of their side without losing their minds. And it's called the Fishbowl. Moni and Ciaran are our blue panelists here at the roundtable. John and I are red. Ciaran and Moni, you are first in the fishbowl. John and I are going to listen closely as you answer 2 questions about how your side, the politically blue side, approaches today's tough topic. So tell us first, how are your side's preferred approaches to media good for democracy and good for the country?
All right,
I can jump in
Ciaran,
first.
Go
Moni,
ahead.
does that work?
Totally.
Well, I think it's hard to define what exactly the left is or the blue side when it comes to media, but I think people generally these days refer to mainstream media, and I'll go with that definition. The New York Times, which some people call the paper of record and which was my paper growing up. I think the Times still does a good job with basic journalistic standards. They have editors, they fact check, and generally, if they get something factually wrong, they will issue a correction. I think there's a young generation of journalists that are importantly challenging traditional narratives. The 1619 Project, for example, put forward a new narrative that places slavery and the Black experience at the heart of American history, when in the past it had generally been relegated to the sidelines. And lastly, I think the Times does make an effort to cover stories that may not align with their audience's political preferences. So, for example, I know that during the Black Lives Matter protests, the Times did publish several series on small businesses that were being destroyed and looted, which may have been an inconvenient fact for certain activists.
Yeah, I hear all that. Yes, thank you. And I happened to have served on something called the Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Committee some years ago, and we revised something called the SPJ Code of Ethics. It's considered a really important kind of central document for media ethics. And one of the categories of ethical guidelines in that document is headlined with the phrase minimize harm. So when I think of how political blues tend to approach all questions, including questions of media, it's a lot about how can we make sure that people are not harmed in the process of telling the nation's stories. And so I see the blue side being really good for the country in that it's constantly thinking about care and harm and who might be in the way, right? Like who might be in harm's way as things happen. So there's a couple of these guidelines I'll just read out very quickly. One of them is, I lost my way. Seek truth and report is the other one. Yeah, so for example, let's see, avoid pandering to lurid curiosity, even if others do. Balance the public needs for information against potential harm or discomfort. Pursuit of the news is not a license for arrogance or undue intrusiveness. So things like that, where the blue side minimizes harm, I think is a strength.
Absolutely. And what are your reservations or concerns about how your own side tends to approach the role of media?
Ciaran, what do you think on this one?
I think the mainstream media can be condescending to conservatives. I think you see it in the way they're covering vaccine skepticism and vaccine hesitancy, which is not isolated to conservatives. You also have folks who have not been getting vaccinated in urban areas who may not be conservative. But I think the tone is one of disbelief and almost derision. And I think that it's unhelpful to try to shame people into getting vaccinated, because I think it's counterproductive. And I think there are other examples of that as well. And I think that while mainstream media puts an emphasis on diversity, there isn't always diversity when it comes to ideology in terms of what they cover or in terms of who they select to publish opinion pieces.
I totally agree with Ciaran's reservation on that. I have another reservation that someday I kind of hope to like write a big essay on if I ever have the time. We all have so much time. But from minimize harm, that principle, I think a lot of mainstream journalists, again, are very good about thinking, how do you give voice to the voiceless? That's another journalistic, standard motto. And often, especially today, journalists think about power dynamics. Who is sort of at the bottom, who's at the top? How do you make sure that you give those at the bottom of the power dynamic more voice, more power in society? And that's all really important. But one thing that I'm hesitant on is that I think that one form of power that the blue side has a hard time ever acknowledging even exists is the power of communication. So I think often I'll see voices on the left on top of an enormous social media platform with huge reach claim powerlessness because they're speaking for some disempowered group. So while they might be speaking for a disempowered group, it seems disingenuous to not also include the power of the platform, the power of the reach as a form of power, and then ask ourselves, wait, who doesn't have that power? And who
Excellent.
are we not listening to?
Very good. Y'all are doing a great job of our fundamental fishbowl principle, which is like, own both sides, own all of it. All right, John, it's our turn. the Reds' turn. What do you see in our red side's approach to media that is good for the country?
Yes, I'd like to note that I've got my jersey on, by the way. Yeah, well, I think that conservatives are always sort of feel like they're on the outside looking in terms of the mainstream thrust of media coverage. I think that what conservatives bring to the conversation that I think is very much necessary is a focus on differentiating between journalism and commentary, journalism and editorializing, because I think that from a conservative vantage point, and not even just for conservatives, I think most independents and really many folks on the left feel this way too, looking at the mainstream media. These things oftentimes sort of bleed together, where people who are presenting themselves as journalists and not commentators are making statements that are clearly biased in a way that shows that, just for example, like nobody is confused about where Don Lemon, as a self-described journalist, falls in terms of how he feels about Donald Trump. And it's not reading between the lines. He'll come right out and call Trump all sorts of things. And you might agree with him on everything he says about Trump. But if journalism as an institution matters, and if it is supposed to be defined by the pursuit of objectivity, that kind of editorializing from the mouths of people who would refer to themselves as journalists is a huge part of what makes many people lose trust in the institution as a fair arbiter of truth, right? And so conservatives tend to bring a focus on that to the conversation, and I think it needs to be there.
I agree completely, and that's pretty similar to my sort of most important view on this subject of like what conservatives bring. So I am a conservative who spent 5 years working at the New York Times, and I have to tell you that I grew up in a liberal household. The Times was also my paper growing up, Ciaran, and I was really excited to work for this like bastion of like objectivity and like high journalistic standards. And like I have a lot of respect for any institution that can do rigorous fact checking and admit it when they're wrong, even though it's not in their interest. And I think the Times is very good on that. But I was just really crushed, honestly, to see just how unaware the other reporters were of the way that their view of the world affected which stories do they think are stories, which facts do they think are facts, which facts are relevant to which stories. And I think that the conservative approach to media is a pretty skeptical one, but I think that's pretty darn necessary. I spent some time in China, and somebody told me once there something I thought was very insightful, which is that, and this is just their opinion, but that Chinese folks look at the media better than Americans because they know it's censored. And so they know they're always looking at it with skepticism and saying, well, okay, but like, do I totally trust this? I'm gonna look at other sources. And I just think, I think that's a really, really essential thing, especially as ideology, in my mind, infects journalism more and more. So, all right, John, it's our turn to talk about our concerns about the red side's approaches. You wanna go first?
Right. Yeah, sure. Okay, so, I think that, and there's a degree to which this is perhaps, let me just keep it focused on the red side, like you asked. I think that on the red side, there has been a gateway to politically convenient misinformation, which is a problem. And this goes back before the 2020 election. I mean, I can remember when Barack Obama was running for president, they made a big deal about him having attended a madrasa or something in Indonesia as a child, which now I think the term madrasa means school. It wasn't technically inaccurate, but it was framed in a way to suggest that he had some deep sort of like foreign Islamic allegiance, which made him a troubling person to have in the White House. So it's suggestive and demonizing in that way. I remember back during the Iraq War, shortly after it was very clearly not the case, demonstrated that this was not the case, something like 55% of Fox News viewers believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in that country. And of course, that was the rationale for us going to war. And that was a huge push from Fox News and other conservative outlets across the country around a Republican administration. And so, things like that have been a problem, I think, on the conservative side. And now some election campaign, election fraud claims being made and so forth, I think some of that pattern continues.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's an issue too. I mean, the simple answer for me would be money. I think that the business, I am so glad that major conservative media outlets exist, but I feel like Fox News is more, Fox in particular is more, what is the word? Like, it suffers more from the problem of if it bleeds, it leads. If, finding whatever its readers want to hear and emphasizing that, because that is what makes them money. And I just can't support that. I think it's really corrosive. And my hope is that we see a resurgence of journalistic ethics across the board. I think that's kind of the only thing that will save us on this front. So now that each side has had a chance to listen to the other, it is time to get curious. Blues, you are up. What questions do you have for the Red Lens on this issue that you'd like me and John to tackle, speaking from our own personal points of view? And I will note that at this point in the conversation, you and I are free to interrupt each other as reasonable in order to keep this dynamic. So Ciaran, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, given that Trump is the most popular figure in the Republican Party, the fact that he might run for president, and if he does run for president, he'll be running on the lie that he was the legitimate victor of the 2020 election, a lie which polls show a majority of Republicans believe. How can conservative media counter this misinformation, which will be so deeply embedded in the red body politic?
Easy question, Ciaran.
I know. I was just thinking, geez.
Way to keep it lighthearted, pal.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. I am somebody who does not believe that the election was stolen, even as I think feel like I have a bit of sympathy for why it is people do not necessarily trust some of the institutions, including the media, which tells them that they've got nothing to worry about when it comes to voter fraud. And, that's in part because I think you can go down a list of things where conservatives look at the mainstream media as having been dishonest with them in the past. And this isn't to take the onus of responsibility off of Donald Trump or anything like that, by no means. But I think that it's important just across the board for media outlets to be true to empirical, to be true to the facts, to be true to empirical reality, right? And to not lift up conspiratorial claims that come from dubious sources of authority or that are based on dubious empirical premises in the same way that seems to equate their legitimacy with claims that come from more well-grounded starting points. But it becomes a bit of a question in terms of what that looks like because people will disagree.
I think that's a very fair, Ciaran, I think that's a really fair question. And I think because of in my view, the influence of money, I think the right does have, on the left, I would say it's ideology. So I don't think either side is clean here, but I think there's a big problem with information that sells being the information that is promoted. And what would you do? Well, good gracious. One thing is, I would like to see a public upswell. So as somebody who used to work for the media, I'm acutely aware of the fact that the media will give people what they want. And so I would love to see people ask for something different, ask for, I want to see some public citizens alliance or something that says, we want a different kind of media. And so I would love to see that, just because it would change the business model, or it would change the inputs to the business model in a way that I think would help. In terms of a specific small step that I would like to see them take, I would be very interested in seeing red media do a better job of naming, of correctly phrasing sources. So I think they do see their job as to lift up the alternate narratives that are swirling all over the country that blue media miss. But what I think they don't do a good job of is saying, this is an idea people have, or this is a perspective a lot of people believe. Instead, they just say, this is true. And so I would like to see much better reporting in the sense of naming sources and naming that they are sources rather than just sort of cherry picking the headline and making it sound like it's true. So,
can I interrupt April on something real quick?
Yeah,
April, if you don't mind. You made a claim just a little bit ago that said that your concern with right-leaning media is that money is too big a factor in influencing their decisions. I just want to point out the fact that in the 2016 election, Donald Trump benefited enormously from free media coverage, not just or even primarily from Fox News and conservative media outlets, but from CNN, ABC, NBC.
Very
CBS.
true.
And that was that not driven by ratings and, financial concerns as much as anything? Okay, so.
Absolutely. But I think that my view on this is that Fox News had an ingenious, from a business perspective, business model that forced the other major media outlets to follow it into a more sort of outrage-centric way of approaching. But yeah, I mean, totally. The problem is by no means only on the right. It's just that I think it's more egregious.
Right. Okay, I interrupted the flow. No.
That's
good.
Is, as I said, that is acceptable. I will, bop you if not. So Moni, your turn. What's your question for the Reds?
So April, you had mentioned that conservative media is skeptical and that it's good that they're skeptical. As someone who's been a career journalist most of my working life, I've been frustrated by the fact that liberal media and conservative media don't do a great job coming together or talking to each other. So I guess I would ask you, both of you, you and John, do you believe that conservative media should be separate and continue to be separate from what's called mainstream or liberal media? If so, what about that do you think is helpful? If not, what about that division do you think is harmful?
It's a great question. I absolutely do not think it should continue to be separate. I think it will until, quote, liberal media or mainstream media returns to real objectivity, because I think what's happening is that ideology has infected the dominant sources. And then there are people in the country all over the place who are saying, wait, this can't be true. This is so far from my lived reality. And so then
they don't resonate with it. They know something's missing.
Yeah. And so then conservative media has this sort of rebellious, fight the man kind of energy. And none of that is what we want. What we want is a series of institutions that, have different starting points, different sort of points of emphasis, perhaps, but that follow journalistic standards, that live up to that. And man, it is hard to see that happening. Which is why I go to the consumer and say maybe a consumer-driven change would work. But John, what do you think?
Well, I think that there's actually an argument to be made for them continuing to be separate. If you look
really
interesting.
Yeah, well, we always look back on the golden era of journalism and so forth, and we always think back to Walter Cronkite. By the way, my apologies to our newsletter readers who noticed that I spelled Cronkite with a K instead of a C.
You did?
And my editor did not catch that, Monica. I'll have people know.
Mea culpa, mea culpa.
My apologies for that. Nevertheless,
you can issue a correction. It's fine.
People look back on the golden age of journalism, Walter Cronkite and so forth, and look at that as an era when the institution of journalism had the trust of the American people. And of course, I think it did much more than it does today. But even back then, conservatives felt like they were completely left out of the mainstream narrative in terms of what Cronkite and other folks at the major media networks were talking about and how they're framing issues. Reporters from either CBS or NBC were, I think, literally spat upon at the Republican convention for Barry Goldwater's nomination in 1964. Walter Cronkite was somebody who I believe there's some credible evidence to suggest that he bugged a GOP presidential candidate at a convention or at his hotel room. I forget the exact circumstances, but there's all sorts of reasons, whether real or imagined, for conservatives to feel, even in the 1960s, that the mainstream media was not reflecting their perspectives and their values. And so for many conservatives—
But why should that continue? Why should that division continue?
For many conservatives, the rise of conservative media outlets was a breaking of a trend that did not allow their voices to be a part of the national conversation. So look, I'm not saying that it absolutely should continue. I think that what should continue is I would like to see a coming together on the basics of journalism, but the editorial, diversity of American political commentary should continue. And those
so I think that's really interesting. And I just want to add one thing, which you've persuaded me against the thing I originally said to some degree. Nice. I think that we should still have institutions that have real rigorous journalistic integrity, but you have reminded me that it's also the case that you're just never going to get objectivity in a deep way if you assume that, because people are not capable of seeing the world outside of their fundamental assumptions, they're just not. And so that actually leads to, it's our turn to ask questions. And John, I know I told you you're going to go first, but I'm going to go first because the segue so naturally, and then we'll get to you. I'm curious, Mani and Ciaran, do you see, like, first of all, do you see the blue lens bias in the mainstream media that conservatives are always shouting about? Because it seems really obvious to me, but I don't know if you guys see it. And if you do, what do you think is the best answer to that? Like, do you agree with what I just said, that like people can't really be expected to leave their assumptions at the door? So we should basically have a diversity, like a kind of democratic cacophony of media sources offering different things? Or do you think objectivity is really more possible than that?
Well, I'll start. So on the do I see the bias question? Yes, I do. And when I started out in journalism, I didn't. And I've thought a lot about that, because I remember I used to go up to folks in the newsroom and kind of say, what about this? And basically what I would hear was, no, this isn't a bias. We're just being responsible. We're just telling the truth. And so for many years, I really took that, and for the most part, totally well-intentioned. But now, particularly that things are so divided and that I am close to a lot of conservatives, I'm reading news from various sources very intentionally, and I'm seeing that bias. But I want to be clear. I mean, the bias, it's about partisan media. So yes, the liberal mainstream media, which does have a very, very powerful platform, covers a lot of our culture and the messages people receive about America and American life, I think does have a liberal bias. I think that they do kind of tend to select certain narratives as being the right ones at the expense of others that are not any less valid. And one thing, I'll mention, there's a bridge builder named Ibu Patel, who I once saw give a quote that he's sort of known for, where he says, it's not just the diversity you like. And so that's one way I think that a liberal bias tends to crop up, where, whatever groups might be lower on the power scale, but are kind of on stage for liberals, those are the ones that get a lot of attention. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other groups, things like class, things like ideological beliefs, when they're perceived by liberals, well, those folks have power in these other ways. So we're not, we don't, it's not so much priority for us to make sure that those voices are elevated on these particular issues. And I think that makes journalists miss a lot. I think that also the liberal bias, the mainstream bias, tends to focus a lot on, data and science, and all of that is like great. And when you say it, it's like data and science, what could be better than that? But the truth is that truth is more than just facts. Truth is also narratives, how facts are stitched together. And truth is also what resonates with different groups of people with their own lives and lived experience. So I do think that the liberal media can miss a sort of intimate familiarity and kind of a validation for conservatives' approach different aspects of life differently, and their truth may not ring true with everything that the studies are asking. What about the questions we're not studying, right? What about those undiscovered facts? So
I love that.
I do believe that.
Totally. Ciaran, curious about your thoughts on that, and then I want to get John's question in.
Yeah, I definitely think there's bias. I think that both sides claim rationality and say they're the ones pointing to data and facts and empiricism. I also think that institutional gatekeepers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, while remaining enormously influential with reporters and policymakers and elites, I think have become relatively less influential when you consider the rise of podcasts and YouTubes. I mean, like Joe Rogan's podcast or Jordan Peterson's videos on YouTube, they're just as mainstream as the New York Times is.
That's a good point.
In terms of the amount of people who watch them, how available they are, how much conversation they're driving, just not necessarily in certain halls of power, but in terms of the greater American population, I think the mainstream has broadened.
Yeah, that's fair. It brings up the point of what the heck is the mainstream anyway?
Yeah,
who gets to define that anyway, right? There's a lot of terms to be narrowed down.
Well,
totally. So yeah, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that I think that part of what makes mainstream is also the institutional sort of gravitas that it is seen as carrying, aside from just sort of the size of the audience. But I've got a question for you two blues. And also shout out to Eboo Patel, founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, since you mentioned him, Monica, somebody we ought to have on the show sometime.
Yes.
I basically have sort of a doubling down of April's question, but I want to put it to you too in this way. Aside from their politics, this isn't to pick on Don Lemon. I never say that I don't like Don Lemon. I like Don Lemon. But aside from their politics, what is the difference between Don Lemon and Sean Hannity? Other than the fact that one describes himself as a journalist and the other admits that he's a commentator.
Well, I have to say that I don't really watch either Don Lemon or Sean Hannity. Mm-hmm. I imagine they're both prone to bloviation. And
yes, sometimes.
I think that Sean Hannity has
you could
less
use Bill Maher or
something
probably if you.
I think Sean Hannity.
But see, this is exactly. Well, keep going. But there's a reason I don't
Sean Hannity
for Don Lemon. Yeah.
I think Sean Hannity has less reservations than Don Lemon about pushing bald-faced lies.
Short and to the point.
Fighting words.
Okay. No, agree.
I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
do you think he thinks they're lies though? Like, I mean,
that's such a great question.
Really? You think he thinks that? Because I think he probably thinks he's like sharing the perspective that everyone around him affirms. And
you think Sean Hannity thinks that Trump won the 2020 election?
I think that there is a community of that there are bubbles and that people tend to believe what the people around them believe. I mean, it's also very convenient, right? Like in the same, and this happens on both sides, that like it's very hard to go against the grain of your own side when you've made your whole career, when like your whole career is dependent on them. However, you raise a fair question. I guess I don't really know if he believes it. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these folks try not to look at it too closely. If they just, but sorry, Monica.
Who knows what anybody believes? But Monica, go ahead and jump in.
I was gonna say, I mean, I don't know that I would go as far as Ciaran, although I totally I empathize with that point of view. I do think that there is a difference between Don Lemon at CNN, the anchor, and Sean Hannity, the very much like opinion analysis, hugely powerful voice on the right, who has headlined Trump rallies, who has absolutely no hesitation to say exactly who he's for, to bully the heck out of whoever he doesn't like, and to do it, he believes, I think, genuinely on behalf of people who feel the way he does. And I think that that's how he's climbed to so much popularity. He knows who he's speaking for, and he knows what sorts of instincts he's speaking from. I don't think Don Lemon goes all the way there at all, but I do believe that if you were to watch CNN 10 years ago, you wouldn't find someone who was quite as open about their politics and their particular opinions as Don Lemon is now. And that person was holding the exact same, supposedly, objectivity in journalism is sort of passé these days, but supposedly the same kind of platform. But I'll say it's been replaced with transparency and some other things that are not necessarily bad substitutes.
Okay, interesting. John, you were going to say something, but maybe
I don't know if I'm allowed to answer my own question. I probably I probably
dynamic.
Right. I'm really go for it. And then I just have to ask you guys more about the thing about people believing stuff. But John.
I was just going to say that, Monica, first of all, I think that you're right. I think if you rewind the clock, you see, like just with Don Lemon in particular, that there was a period of time where you couldn't necessarily tell exactly where he was coming from politically, because I think that he sort of stuck to sort of the traditional sort of journalistic veneer. And I think that that's sort of changed. As a matter of fact, I seem to recall him describing himself as his role as a journalist is summoning his own sort of lived experience to frame the issues and so forth. And you could argue that that's the exact opposite of sort of the attitude with which we take to approach objectivity, although maybe there's a conversation there. But Bill Maher may be every bit as, left-leaning and anti-Trump as Don Lemon is. As a matter of fact, he is. But Bill Maher embraces the fact that he's a commentator and a comedian and all that, and so does Sean Hannity, right? All the points taken, Sean Hannity is an official Trump cheerleader, but that's kind of the distinction that I wanted to get to, the blurring of the lines between journalism and commentary.
It's a great
question. You think Sean Hannity embraces the fact that he's a comedian?
No, a commentator, not a comedian.
No.
Ciaran was deliberate.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I just really quickly, I know we've got to wrap
Sean,
this
we'd love to have you on the podcast, by the way. Sean and Don. We'd love to have you on.
Totally. Sean and Don together.
Hopefully we don't burn out bridges already.
That'd be so interesting. But I just have to ask one more question that comes out of this, which is like, what do we think about what these people actually believe? Because I would submit that it's easy for people on the left who think the election was not stolen to be like, Sean Hannity can't possibly believe that. He's a smart guy, right? But I would argue that
believes it.
I'm not trying to draw a total equivalence because I think the phenomena on left and right are different, but I really think that like that there are a lot of journalists on the left, particularly younger ones, honestly, which frightens the heck out of me, who believe that the fundamental lens of anti-racism and all of that is true, and this turns their journalism into something more like advocacy. We had a debate recently among students over whether journalists should even focus on objectivity as opposed to advocacy, and it was very nuanced and complex. And it was not obvious to people, and so that seems to me to be just as much of an intoxicant or a sort of distorting lens that people do believe. And so I'm curious, just like, do you think people on the left sort of believe things that they shouldn't? And if so, how is that different from the Sean Hannitys of the world?
Oh, it's such a great question. Ciaran, go ahead.
Well, I think there's sort of a fundamental...
You can just say no, Ciaran, it's fine. Go ahead.
No, I'm also troubled by that. I think that
okay.
People are elevating advocacy over objectivity, then they're not really being journalists as traditionally defined. But I think one is a question of like ideology, and the other is more
Integrity?
about power and cynically manipulated facts to push a political agenda.
Yeah, I think if you're a journalist, there's of course I'm forgetting now, but there's a famous quote from an editor of an alternative magazine who told his reporters basically they wanted to know, when can I have a point of view? And he said, you can have a point of view that you share with the public when you do the work to understand all the points of view. And so for me, the question of advocacy in journalism is more conditional on whether journalists are actually doing what I believe is the first and core duty of journalism, which is listening and being curious and reporting on what people out there think. I think that there is an ego thing going on, no thanks to social media, that's making a lot of journalists really feel that their own voices are what matters. Their own voices are what's going to get their publications, read, and frankly, to survive in a really brutal economic landscape for media. And that's all really terrible, because I don't think that's journalists' job. But it's great for there to be some advocacy. I just feel like journalists need to be able to demonstrate, I've really walked the walk. I've really tried to understand all the points of view. So what I'm really saying is all journalists should take Braver Angels workshops and then go back to advocacy.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I totally agree. The problem is that I think that all the points of view gets defined awfully narrowly sometimes, and I'll get off my soapbox. But
True.
Yes, I love this conversation. I think this is great. So let's go ahead and wrap with one thing you're taking away about how the other side views this issue in 30 seconds or less. Moni, you want to start?
Yeah, I really liked what you said about conservative approach to media is skeptical and must remain skeptical. That seems really tied to the spirit of conservatism and the real validity and why we need it. So I love that.
Awesome. John?
Well, I think that the other side is represented by Ciaran and Mónica anyway, have a belief in the need for core sort of journalistic fundamentals, a willingness to be able to understand all sides of an issue, and a willingness to be able to adhere to the facts and to empirical integrity where it may lead. It sounds like you guys haven't fully given up on the value of objectivity, but just have a sense in terms of the sensitivity with which that has to be pursued. So I'm all for it.
All right. Ciaran?
One thing that occurs to me is I think that me and Mónica might be closer to the center of gravity of blues when it comes to the American population than you, April, and John are to reds when it comes to the population. I'm not necessarily talking about in intellectual circles, I just mean in the country. And so I wonder, I'd love to get more like Trump supporting reds in on this conversation too. to get their sense of advocacy, epistemology, and objectivity too.
You're not radical enough for me either, Ciaran. Let me just.
I was gonna say, you sound like a conservative. Oh, you're not a real conservative. That's classic conservative. Like, you're not a real whatever.
Fine, softy.
Love it.
Okay. Hammer and sickle, brother. All right.
I mean, that's right. Totally. Yeah. Well, so my takeaway is, I guess the first thing I have to say is just that I was really glad. It meant a lot to me to hear each of you say that you see the problem. Like, Ciaran, it really hit me when you said that you see the mainstream media condescending to conservatives, because it feels half the time like we're walking around in a world where, like, we're the only ones who even know what's going on, and that everyone else is like, oh, that's just fine, that's just the way things are. And it just meant a lot to me, honestly, to hear that, like, you guys can see that that's there. And so, yeah, I mean, my takeaway is that if we can all see the problem, we can all work on it. So I'm pretty pleased about that. So this conversation, of course, is far from over. And to keep it going, we'd like to invite all of you, our listeners, to go to the Braver Angels YouTube channel, where you will find video from our national community debate on whether the media undermines free speech and fair elections, as well as from our latest America's Public Forum, featuring journalists Matt Taibbi and Isaac Saul, interviewed by Ciaran. Moni, want to take us on to our next segment?
Yes, happy to take that torch, because now we're going to try something kind of fun. We're going to put one of us roundtable panelists into the hot seat and dig in as candidly as we can to the challenges that come at us daily, from working to depolarize America, no easy feat, and build this house united with all y'all. So Ciaran O'Connor, you are Chief Marketing Officer of Braver Angels, and you've been with the organization for how long? Almost since the beginning.
Yes, more than 4 years.
Yeah, there you go. So for the next, couple minutes, tell us about a challenge you're facing in this work, and then John, April, Ciaran, and I will do our very best to make you feel even more completely overwhelmed by it. I'm just kidding. We're going to ask questions that we hope can help unpack those issues and help us work at it together. So Ciaran, the floor is yours. What challenge are you facing that you want to bring to the Braver Angels Roundtable?
Sure. I will divulge a challenge, but first I will just say a little bit about an opportunity, because I want to provide positive negative balance here. I think our work with Congress, our work with the institution of politics, is really exciting. And I think you're going to see big things from Braver Angels, from one-to-one conversations between members of Congress to Braver Angels candidate debates in 2022. Yes. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's a big opportunity for the organization, both externally and internally, in terms of galvanizing us in a new post-Trump, for now, era. In terms of a challenge, I think there's always emotional challenges when it comes to doing the work of depolarization, because everyone has their own frustrations, grievances, anger, fear, exhaustion. And sometimes that comes into tension with the emotional uplift and hope and compassion and empathy and humility. In some ways, sometimes those emotions are constantly in tension in all of our lives, in our relationships, in various professional endeavors. But when it comes to the work of political depolarization in the current American climate, those tensions can feel so visceral, and it can feel really draining. And like, sometimes I feel as though I have to give up my faith, and I don't want to give up my faith, but when it comes to
your faith in what, Ciaran? Your faith in what?
My faith in our leaders' commitment to the people they serve, and the cynicism and just taking advantage of ordinary people who are not cynical and believe what they believe because they want to protect themselves and protect their families. And it can be incredibly frustrating when I look and see just some of the things state legislatures are doing when it comes to voter suppression, or these endless circus-like audits where they're just looking for non-existent evidence of crazy voter fraud conspiracy theories, and just how that bleeds down, and having tens of millions of Americans believe things that if you believe, then it's justified perhaps to rise up in violent insurrection. So certainly sometimes there's discouraging developments out in the country, but I feel like I can always return to my relationships at Braver Angels and see the progress that all of the work has made within ourselves and within our members, and even within the majority of our YouTube commenters, except for those who comment on John's video to say he talks too much. We have room for those people too.
It's not just the diversity you like.
That's right. That's right. John, you wanna open up the discussion? What question do you have for Ciaran to try to troubleshoot the intersection of that kind of, are we losing our faith in our leaders? We're trying to depolarize America, but why? Look, everything's just so crazy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, Ciaran, how much is your faith in democracy contingent on your faith in America's leaders versus the American people and the people that you know, left, right, and center?
You mean the people in my life?
Yeah, just ordinary folks and so forth. In other words, like, what's the key barometer for you? Because I can see a person saying, you can't trust the president and Congress, and therefore there's no hope for the system. But I don't think that our elected officials are the only ones that matter, even the ones that matter most in the long run in that equation, because I think that they're more a reflection of us than we are a reflection of them at the end of the day, in some sense. So that just occurred to me.
I agree. I think that my faith is generally restored when I talk to people, my friends, family, people in person. Sometimes the people I follow on social media might shake the faith a little bit, but oftentimes it's the people in power, whether it's government or business, who have the most influence on people's lives, on people's ability to get healthcare and educate their kids and try to protect the planet rather than deny that climate change is happening or whatever else. And so sometimes the anger and almost disbelief at the actions that people take to protect their own interests at the expense of everyone else can feel intense, just because those actions have more weight than the guy down the street who believes what he believes in complete good faith.
So Ciaran, can you
and that's one reason why I think the work that we're doing, starting to engage directly institutions, is going to be exciting, because ultimately we need to challenge our leaders to more accurately represent us as people, and that will require changing incentives.
I know April has a question. I want to just ask you, Ciaran, to recount. You and I had a conversation earlier about what Nancy Pelosi said about Kevin McCarthy recently, and what Kevin McCarthy then said about Nancy Pelosi, and the kind of escalation. So could you recount that? And I guess my question is, how much of your concern, or this sort of attack on your faith in like the ultimate American project, when we see some of these behaviors from elected leaders, is about what they're modeling versus what they're doing for their own interests, but also what they're modeling for the American public?
Yeah, well, I think there's sometimes a difference between rhetoric and action, although rhetoric can morph into action. So I think Nancy Pelosi calling Kevin McCarthy a moron is very unhelpful, and just sort of models the immature name calling that poisons our politics. And I think that's not to say that ordinary folks don't call politicians morons, or that I haven't called politicians morons, although I think after working for Braver Angels, I would more readily appreciate how both unhelpful and likely counterproductive that is. I think Kevin McCarthy saying that he wants to hit Nancy Pelosi with the gavel is a little worse, because it's, you know, talking about violence, and I think that there's the rhetoric, and then there's also the actions, right? Like there's anti-democratic rhetoric, and then there's, you know, voting to try to overthrow an election, and that rhetoric and action is obviously tied up. So it's incredibly concerning, and I think that generally it's an escalatory cycle whose logical conclusion at the extreme is violence. So it's definitely not great to see, you know, the Speaker of the House or the other Speaker of the House saying they want to
for sure
the other person's
terrible
head.
Yeah. So I just want to commend you, Ciaran, for raising this publicly, because I think that I have thought that for a while that there's a little bit of a wave of demoralization going through our field, partly because the election was like adrenaline rush after adrenaline rush, and now we're just back to the same old, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear here, but stuff. And so I really appreciate it, and I just resonate so strongly, like that. It feels it's toxic, and it's very hard sometimes to like see all that stuff and like go to work and be like, this, believe it matters. And so I just super appreciate you raising this, and I can only imagine that a lot of our listeners feel that way too. My question for you, so I see this as spiritual work, which is to say, it's like work against any other kind of evil. Like it takes it out of you, and you've got to go back to the well and re-nourish yourself. And like for me on the debate team, that's talking to my volunteers, because they are like, speaking of torches, it feels like they're like, no, we can do this, and I'm like, maybe we can. Maybe we can. So I'm curious both what that well is for you, if there is one, and also if you do anything. You're such a media guy that like, I just feel like the exposure must be awful. Like, do you do anything to like limit your exposure to the toxicity?
I do try to stay off Twitter. I would say that my well generally consists of my coworkers.
Yeah.
It's a pretty deep well on this call.
Yeah,
for
real.
And I don't know. I mean, the positive energy is infectious.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Yep.
I feel
what happens when you're
go ahead, but I feel exactly the same way. Like if you guys all left, I don't
know
if I could do this.
No. So true.
Yeah.
I think you spoke for all of us on that. So Ciaran, thank you for that. I definitely extend April's gratitude. This obviously isn't easy for any of us. We're just about at the end of our time, so I'm going to pass that Olympic torch on. Oh, actually, no. Sorry, I forgot one thing. Ciaran, give us sort of your takeaways from this discussion about that initial challenge. You know about your deep well. What else are you taking away from this as to how you can continue to do the work of building a House United?
Well, I think it's nice to know that one is not alone, and I would be curious if any listeners resonated with what I had to say and can share their own personal experiences of navigating their own emotions when it comes to their feelings about politics and our leaders, who I guess in some ways are reflections of us.
Yep, they are. On that note, I invite listeners to email media@braverangels.org with any of your thoughts, reflections, questions. We would love to connect with you. We know that there's a lot of folks hungry for all kinds of solutions up and down this problem. And we're really glad that you're listening. And we'd love to, just get to know you and your concerns. So John, you want to close us out with our checkout question?
Yeah. There you go. I am Trevor Hoffman. I'm coming in to close this out, bottom of the ninth. And I want to thank folks for tuning in to the Brave Angels podcast. I just dated myself there a little bit for baseball fans, by the way.
I have no idea what you just said.
Yeah, right. I don't even follow baseball day to day. I was following baseball like in the late 90s and early 2000s. So Padres fans, Trevor Hoffman, you guys will get it. But yeah, this has been an enjoyable conversation. Really loved it. We're going to go ahead and close out the way we tend to open up, and that is with a question. So the question for everybody, 10 seconds or less, or a minute and a half if you're me, is if you were to spend the day with any news media personality, living or dead, who would it be and why? Starting with Ciaran O'Connor, you're warmed up. Go for it.
Well, I wanted to steal Walter Cronkite, but I won't. So I will say Robert Caro.
Who's that?
He's the one who has written the fabulous biographies of Lyndon B. Johnson, and his journalism runs deep.
There you go. Okay, we got to vote for Robert Caro. Going next.
And Hunter S. Thompson.
Ooh.
We all need some gonzo journalism too.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
yes.
That's right. He wrote the book, the one on Vegas. What am I talking
Fear
about?
and Loathing. But
Fear
he
and
also
Loathing.
wrote a book where he covered a presidential campaign.
Okay, excellent, beautiful. Okay, go on, blue red. April Lawson, follows to you.
Yeah. So those are like cool, interesting types of media personalities. I was just going with sort of the more straight, like New York Times columnists, and like I love David Brooks and Russ Douthit, both of them. I worked with both of them. I would spend a day with them happily anytime. Like they're wonderful. But since I worked for them, I'll give you a different answer too, and that's Maureen Dowd. So she is this woman, like you should see her office. This is like the most interesting woman I've ever, like, whose office I've ever seen. It's like this like explosion of like cool, interesting, sexy, like, so she has one of those like tables that has like a woman's leg with fishnets as the like legs of it, and like everything's covered with shawls. It's a total mess, but she understands, right? Don't we all? And she's just so cool. Like, and I worked across the hall from her, and she would like sometimes say hi to me at the printer, and like if I got to spend a day with her, I would be really into that.
Beautiful.
Oops.
Did the fishnet. Mónica Guzmán, go.
I really want to spend a day with Chris Wallace of Fox News. Every time I see his interviews with high-profile folks, including an interview with Donald Trump before he left the White House, I was just so floored. We talked a little bit today about the importance of staying true to some of the professional craft of journalism. If not objectivity, well, geez, some kind of responsibility to truth and to transparency. I just think Wallace just holds that down at Fox News at a time when many others who do and did, ended up leaving for a bunch of reasons. And I just want to be there next to him when he says what he really thinks, about what he's trying to pin down. He's the son of Mike Wallace, an absolutely legendary journalist, and I'm so grateful he exists, because I think he more than almost anyone else is able to sort of take some of those journalistic, the real things that we want to preserve forever about that beautiful craft of telling stories for a nation. And he's doing it in a partisan environment, and he's doing it in a way that bridges people's understanding, and he's not batting an eye on it. That's just how you do it. And I love him for that.
Indeed. Well, I guess it falls to me. Great answer, Mónica. I guess it falls to me to check out then. I am going to go with Dorothy Kilgallen. Do any of you folks know anything about Dorothy Kilgallen? Is that a name that rings a bell? Mónica,
No.
Ciaran, April. Dorothy Kilgallen was the most famous, most significant investigative.
One more time. Okay.
I'm just gonna
Investigative.
I'm just going to say them all again.
John, you're trying to go for the British pronunciation.
I just got to give up on it at some point. Investigative. There we go. I'm losing it, y'all. I'm losing my powers of elocution.
Yes.
Clearly, we need to wrap this up. Back to Dorothy Kilgallen. Dorothy Kilgallen was one of the most important reporters in America in the 1950s, 1960s. She investigated the mob. She covered politics. She was a radio personality. She was a panelist on that classic game show, What's My Line? And there's some books that have been coming out about her recently. She died in 1965. It was thought that she overdosed on medication. But there are all sorts of conspiracies surrounding her because she was a dogged reporter who got to Jack Ruby, who's the club owner who shot Lee Harvey Oswald after John Kennedy was killed, for an interview when I think just about nobody else could pull it off. And she was hot on the trail of solving, or trying to solve at least, the riddle behind the Kennedy assassination. And many people believe that her death ultimately had to do with the progress that she was making. Now, this is just, theories, conspiracy theories, so on and so forth.
Yay, conspiracy theories.
But as a female reporter in particular, in that day and time, Dorothy Kilgallen was, for many folks, a household name and a rock star, and somebody who we've completely forgotten about today in American politics and American journalism, and a high-class, smart and sophisticated person to boot. So Dorothy Kilgallen, that's what I'd like to spend a day with.
Fantastic.
And indeed. And with that, we are a wrap. Monica, Ciaran, April, thank you so much for bearing with my verbal foibles and for being a part of an incredible conversation. And thank you to all of you for joining us for another Braver Angels Roundtable podcast. Support the work of Braver Angels. Get involved. Join us as a member at braverangels.org. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. As ever, we are building a house united. Until next time.